You ever wake up thinking it's just another normal day, only to find out that your HOA has decided to ban something completely harmless? Without warning? Well, that's exactly what happened in our neighborhood. And guess who was behind it? Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, the woman who thinks she owns the entire community. But here's the thing, this time, she messed with the wrong people. Let me tell you how it all started. Saturday mornings in our neighborhood used to be filled with the sounds of kids laughing, sneakers squeaking on driveways, and basketball bouncing against the pavement. It was a routine, a tradition, one that had been a part of our lives for years. Until one morning, when everything changed. I stepped outside, still in my slippers, ready to enjoy my usual cup of coffee on the porch. The air was crisp, the sky a perfect shade of blue. And somewhere down the street, I could hear the familiar thump-thump of a basketball hitting concrete. Then, I saw it, a bright yellow envelope taped to my front door. Now, if you live in an HOA-controlled neighborhood, you know that these envelopes never bring good news. They don't send you friendly reminders or holiday greetings. No, these things are always about violations, fees, or some new ridiculous rule they've decided to enforce. I pulled the letter off the door and unfolded it, scanning the words. As I read, my eyebrows furrowed, my stomach tightened. Immediate violation notice. All basketball hoops must be removed from driveways and front yards. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in fines. I read it again, slower this time. Surely I was missing something. Basketball hoops? Banned? Since when? I stepped off my porch and looked around the street. Our neighborhood was lined with homes that had neatly kept yards, kids' bikes parked on porches, and yes, basketball hoops standing tall at the end of several driveways. They had always been there. What was the problem now? That's when I noticed her. Across the street, standing with her arms crossed, was Karen. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the woman who seemed to take personal offense at the mere existence of fun. The type of person who took morning walks not to enjoy the fresh air, but to inspect everyone's yards, looking for the slightest thing out of place. And now, judging by the smug expression on her face, she was watching me. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. Instead, I turned around, walked back inside, and placed the letter on the kitchen table. My wife, who had just poured herself a coffee, raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" I slid it toward her. "Take a look." She picked it up, skimmed the notice, and then her expression turned from confusion to irritation. "Since when is this a rule?" "That's what I'd like to know," I muttered. She set the paper down with a sigh. "Are they seriously trying to ban basketball hoops? What next? Sidewalk chalk? Kids riding bikes? This is ridiculous." I nodded. "And I have a pretty good idea of who's behind it." We both knew the answer. Karen, the woman who once tried to report our next-door neighbor for having Christmas lights up past January 1st. The woman who complained when another neighbor put up a happy birthday sign for their kid. The woman who, just last summer, had called the HOA on me because my lawn was half an inch too long during a weekend when my mower was broken. This was just another power trip for her, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. An hour later, my phone started blowing up. Our neighborhood had a group chat, a place where we usually shared things like lost pets, garage sale announcements, and occasionally a meme or two about how over-the-top the HOA could be. But that morning, it was on fire. "Did anyone else get that basketball hoop violation notice? Are they serious? My kids play out there every day." Karen strikes again. I swear she lives for this. What's next? Banning lemonade stands? One by one, people started checking their mailboxes and doors, all finding the same notice. It wasn't just a random rule. They were trying to wipe out every single basketball hoop in the neighborhood. And for what? No one had complained. No one had ever said the hoops were a problem. They weren't blocking the street. They weren't causing damage. And they weren't creating noise past reasonable hours. This was purely Karen's doing. And that's when I realized she hadn't even bothered to warn anyone. Usually, with HOA rules, they at least pretended to go through some process. They'd send out notices about upcoming votes, or put something in the community newsletter. But this, there had been no discussion, no warning, no chance for anyone to speak up. Karen had taken it upon herself to push this through, probably by pestering the HOA board until they caved. That's when my frustration turned into something else. Determination. I wasn't about to let Karen dictate what we could and couldn't do in our own driveways. This was far from over. If there's one thing I've learned about HOA enforcers like Karen, it's that they always have an excuse. They don't just say, "I don't like this, so I want it gone." No, they wrap it up in some official-sounding nonsense to make it seem like they're protecting the community. And this time, her excuse? Basketball hoops ruined the neighborhood's image. That was her justification for the sudden ban. Not safety, not noise complaints, not anything remotely logical, just aesthetic. The way she talked, you'd think a couple of kids shooting hoops in their own driveways was the equivalent of spray painting graffiti all over the houses. But here's where things got interesting. There was no actual rule about basketball hoops in the HOA bylaws. None. I knew this because when we first moved in, I had actually taken the time to read the HOA handbook. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to get blindsided by ridiculous fines. And nowhere in the entire document did it say basketball hoops were prohibited. Karen, as usual, was making things up. Later that afternoon, I spotted Karen again, clipboard in hand, pacing up and down the street like she was on official business. I figured it was time for a little chat. I strolled over, casually sipping my coffee. "Morning, Karen," she turned, forcing that overly polite HOA smile, the one people use when they're pretending to be reasonable, but are actually just waiting for you to comply. "Oh, good morning. I assume you've seen the notice," she said, tilting her head. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it. Just wanted to ask, when exactly was this rule passed?" Karen's smile twitched. "Oh, well, it's always been part of the community standards," she said smoothly. "We want to maintain a certain image here, and basketball hoops just don't fit." I raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting, because I actually read the HOA bylaws, and I don't remember seeing anything about basketball hoops." For a second, just a second, Karen hesitated. Then she quickly recovered. "Well, the board had a discussion, and we decided it was time for an update. You understand, right? We have to think about property values." The classic property values argument. The same excuse HOAs use for every arbitrary rule. I crossed my arms. "So let me get this straight. You personally don't like basketball hoops, so you convinced the HOA board to ban them without talking to homeowners first?" Karen's smile thinned. "It's not about what I like," she said, waving a hand dramatically. "It's about preserving the neighborhood's aesthetic. You have to admit, basketball hoops look messy." Messy? I glanced down the street. The basketball hoops weren't broken down eyesores. They weren't covered in rust or leaning over like abandoned relics. They were just normal, well-maintained hoops. Meanwhile, 2 houses down, the Johnsons still had their Christmas wreath on their door, and it was April. Across the street, the Petersons had mismatched patio furniture that looked like it had survived a hurricane. And don't even get me started on the Robinsons' lawn gnome collection, which made their yard look like a weird garden cult. But sure, Karen, tell me more about how a basketball hoop is destroying the community's image. I let out a slow breath. Karen, with all due respect, the neighborhood looked just fine before this. No one complained about the hoops until you decided they were a problem. Karen pursed her lips, clearly annoyed that I wasn't just rolling over and accepting her decree. "Look," she said, adjusting her clipboard, "rules change. It's about keeping things uniform." Uniform. Another HOA favorite. Because, God forbid, a neighborhood have any sign of personality or individuality. I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere arguing with her directly, so I just smiled. "All right, guess we'll see how this plays out." Karen gave me a stiff nod and turned away, marching down the sidewalk like she had just won some grand battle. But this wasn't over. Not even close. By the end of the day, the group chat was in full rebellion mode. "She's making this up. There's no actual rule against basketball hoops. Check the bylaws. Nothing in there about driveways or sports equipment. If this wasn't an official vote, can we fight it? What if we just don't take them down?" That last message got a bunch of thumbs-up reactions. And honestly, it was a good question. Karen could hand out notices all she wanted, but if the rule didn't exist in writing, then was it even enforceable? That's when someone dropped the best message of the day. "Who exactly voted on this? Because I sure as hell wasn't asked." Bingo. Karen had gone behind everyone's backs. She hadn't consulted homeowners. She hadn't put this up for a vote. She had just pressured the HOA board into signing off on it, probably by framing it as a necessary change for the good of the community. The problem? She wasn't expecting this much pushback. The next morning, I was out in my driveway when my neighbor, Tom, walked over. "You keeping yours up?" he asked, nodding toward my basketball hoop. I smirked. "Absolutely," Tom chuckled. "Good, me too. I checked the bylaws last night, and guess what? Not a single mention of basketball hoops." "Yeah, I figured as much," I said. "Karen's bluffing," Tom grinned. "Well, she's in for a surprise then. A bunch of us are planning to show up at the next HOA meeting and demand some answers." Now that was something I could get behind. Karen had spent years ruling the HOA like a personal kingdom, but this time, she went too far. And she was about to find out that people weren't just going to roll over and accept her nonsense. Karen thought she was in control. She strutted around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, with that same self-important smirk. She had bullied enough people into taking down their basketball hoops that she probably assumed she had won. But what she didn't count on? Homeowners weren't just going to roll over and accept it. At first, it started with murmurs, people grumbling in their driveways, frustrated parents complaining in the group chat, kids asking why they couldn't play basketball anymore. But then, the murmurs turned into action. People wanted answers. And the more we looked into it, the clearer it became. Karen was making up rules that didn't exist. The first real sign that something was off came from my neighbor, Lisa. She was the type of person who actually read the HOA bylaws. Unlike most of us who just signed them and shoved them into a drawer, Lisa spent an entire evening combing through the official documents, searching for any mention of basketball hoops. She even went back years, checking if an older rule had somehow been reinstated. Nothing, not a single word about permanent or portable basketball hoops being prohibited. That's when she sent a message to the group chat. Guys, I just read through the entire HOA rulebook. There is no basketball hoop rule. And just like that, everything changed. The next day, I ran into Tom in my driveway. You see Lisa's message? He asked, arms crossed. Oh yeah, I said. Karen's full of it. Tom nodded. I think it's time we start asking some questions. So, that's exactly what we did. We started going door to door, talking to other homeowners, gathering information. The more we talked, the more ridiculous the situation became. It turned out Karen had been handing out fake violation notices. Several people showed us the letters they had received, printed on regular paper, no official HOA letterhead, no signature from an actual board member, just a generic threatening message claiming that basketball hoops were against community standards and needed to be removed immediately to avoid further action. Further action? From who? Karen, one neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez, even told us that when she tried to argue, Karen threatened to fine her. You can't fine me, she had told Karen, standing firm with her arms crossed. Karen had scoffed, flipped through her clipboard and said, we'll see about that. But here's the thing, Karen wasn't on the HOA board. She wasn't a president. She wasn't even a voting member. She was just a volunteer, someone who took it upon herself to police the neighborhood, as if she were running her own little dictatorship. And now, she was exposed. Tom decided to take it one step further. He called up the actual HOA president, a guy named Mark, who, up until now, had been pretty hands-off. When Tom asked about the basketball hoop rule, Mark was confused. What basketball hoop rule? He asked. The one Karen's enforcing, Tom said. Silence. Then a sigh. Karen's not enforcing anything, Mark said. She doesn't have that authority. That's when Tom told him about the fake notices, about the intimidation tactics, about how Karen had convinced half the neighborhood to take down their hoops through sheer force of will. Mark wasn't happy. She can't do that, he muttered. She doesn't have any power to issue fines or make new rules. Well, she thinks she does, Tom replied. Mark promised to look into it, but we knew that wasn't enough. Karen had already done too much damage. And now, we wanted to make sure she never pulled something like this again. So we planned our next move. We weren't just going to expose Karen. We were going to take back control of our own neighborhood. The HOA meeting was packed. Normally, these meetings were dull, with only a handful of homeowners showing up to hear about landscaping budgets and parking regulations. But tonight was different. Word had spread fast. People had been whispering in driveways, texting in the group chat, knocking on doors. Everyone knew Karen had been caught, and now she was about to answer for it. Karen sat near the front of the room, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. She probably thought she was about to enlighten us all, explain why she was just trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood, or some nonsense like that. But as the meeting started, it quickly became clear that she had no control over this conversation. Mark, the HOA president, stood up and cleared his throat. All right, let's get started. I know we have some general community updates, but first, there's an issue that needs to be addressed. He glanced around the room, as if gauging the energy. Homeowners sat with arms crossed, lips pressed together, waiting. Then, he turned to Karen. Karen, I understand you've been issuing violation notices regarding basketball hoops. Karen straightened her back, looking pleased with herself. That's right, she said. I took the initiative because these hoops are ruining the aesthetic of our community. They lower property values and… Mark held up a hand, cutting her off. Karen, we never voted on a basketball hoop ban. For the first time, her smug expression faltered. Well, no, she admitted. But it's an obvious rule. It's a community standard. No, Mark said firmly, shaking his head. It's not in our bylaws. and we never had an official discussion about it. So I have to ask, on what authority did you send out those notices? Silence. Karen's eyes darted around the room. She wasn't expecting this. That's when Tom stood up, holding a stack of papers. "I'd like to present some evidence," he said. Mark gestured for him to go ahead. Tom walked to the front of the room and held up one of Karen's fake violation notices. "I spoke to multiple homeowners who received these, and guess what? They don't have any official HOA signatures. No board approval, just Karen's personal vendetta." Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's face turned red. "That's not true," she blurted out. Tom wasn't done. He slapped another paper onto the table. "This is an email from Mark himself, confirming that there is no basketball hoop rule." More murmurs. Then Lisa stood up. "And I went through the HOA bylaws myself. There is absolutely nothing about basketball hoops." The murmurs turned into full-on whispers. Some people were shaking their heads. Others were glaring at Karen. Then, the final blow. A voice from the back of the room. "Mrs. Gonzalez. Karen, why do you have a basketball hoop in your own backyard?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to Karen. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Busted. The tension in the room was thick. Karen was caught. Not only had she made up rules to bully other homeowners, but she had also been happily ignoring those same rules herself. Mark turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Karen, is this true?" Karen stammered, her confidence cracking. "It's different." "How?" Mark asked, crossing his arms. Karen's jaw clenched. "Mine is in my backyard. It's not visible from the street. It's not an eyesore like the others." The crowd wasn't buying it. Tom let out a dry laugh. "So let me get this straight. You banned basketball hoops because they ruin the neighborhood's image, but only when other people have them?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Busted." Again, people started speaking up. "She threatened me with a fine. She made my son cry when she told him he'd never play basketball here again. She made up rules. She lied." Karen's eyes darted around, desperate for support, but no one was coming to her defense. Mark exhaled and shook his head. "Karen, I think we've heard enough. This was an extreme overreach on your part, and frankly, it's unacceptable." Someone from the board whispered something in his ear. Mark nodded. "Effective immediately. Any violation notices you sent out regarding basketball hoops are null and void." The room erupted in applause. Karen slumped in her chair, humiliated. This wasn't how she thought the night would go. But we weren't done yet, because now we wanted to make sure Karen never pulled something like this again. The neighborhood had been tense for weeks. Ever since Karen decided to wage war on basketball hoops, homeowners had been walking on eggshells, unsure of what ridiculous rules she might invent next. But tonight, we took our streets back. After the HOA meeting where Karen was exposed for making up her own rules, the decision was final. The so-called basketball hoop ban was officially overturned. And the best part? It wasn't just a quiet, bureaucratic decision. The whole neighborhood celebrated. The next morning, a ripple of excitement spread through the community. The group chat was buzzing. "Hoops are back. No more Karen nonsense. Bring them out. Who's up for a game later? Kids versus adults? Someone tell Karen she lost." People wasted no time. Driveways that had sat empty for weeks suddenly came alive again. Parents helped their kids set up hoops that had been shoved into garages. Some dusted off old nets, while others went out and bought brand new ones, just to make a statement. The message was clear. We weren't just putting up basketball hoops. We were putting Karen back in her place. That evening, the street in front of my house was louder than it had been in years. Basketballs dribbled against the pavement. Sneakers squeaked as kids raced down driveways, and laughter filled the air. The sun was dipping low, casting golden streaks across the rooftops, but nobody was ready to call it a night. Even some of the parents joined in. Tom, the same guy who publicly exposed Karen's hypocrisy at the HOA meeting, had his teenage son challenging him to a one-on-one match. Lisa, the neighborhood mom who had dug up the actual HOA bylaws, sat on her porch, sipping her wine and smiling as she watched her twins take turns shooting three-pointers. Mark, the HOA president who had shut down Karen for good, strolled through the neighborhood, taking it all in. And Karen, nowhere to be seen. For someone who had spent the last few weeks parading around like a self-appointed neighborhood sheriff, it was shocking how quickly Karen had disappeared. Her car was parked in the driveway, her porch light was on, but she hadn't stepped outside. No smug lectures about community standards. No clipboard full of fake violation notices. No condescending emails about how basketball hoops were ruining the image of the neighborhood. It was as if she had shrunk into the shadows, watching from behind her curtains, realizing that this time, she had pushed too far, and unlike before, no one was on her side. No supporters, no allies, just a woman who had finally lost her grip on the power she never should have had. The final nail in the coffin? As the games went on, someone cranked up a speaker, and the song that started blasting through the street, "We Are the Champions." I kid you not, a perfect accidental tribute to the neighborhood victory over Karen's nonsense. Some parents started clapping to the beat. Kids who barely understood the lyrics were singing along, just because the energy was infectious. It was a moment of pure, satisfying karma. A battle had been fought, and Karen had lost. Later that night, as things started winding down, I stood in my driveway, arms crossed, taking in the scene. The hoops were staying up. The kids were staying happy. The neighborhood had stopped living in fear of one person's fake authority. Tom walked up beside me, shaking his head with a grin. "Think she's gonna try anything else after this?" I glanced toward Karen's house, where the curtains had twitched ever so slightly, revealing the faintest shadow behind them. "She'd be a fool to," I said. Tom chuckled. "Well, if she does, at least we know how to handle her." And with that, he clapped me on the back and walked home. As the last of the kids packed up their basketballs and the adults retreated to their porches, I heard one last sound, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball echoing down the street, a sound that Karen had tried to silence, a sound that, thanks to us, would never be silenced again. Game on.